welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick. I'm the host of the program, and in just a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce today's guest. But first, a reminder that if you like what you hear, please do take a moment to subscribe. It helps us out, and you can make sure you never miss an episode. Also, we've opened a Literary Prospects shop, so if you're looking for bookish shirts, totes, and gifts, please check that out at literaryprospects.etsy.com. And to grab books featured on the podcast and check out more curated book lists, you can visit the Literary Prospects bookstore on bookshop.org. We'll leave all those links below in the show notes. And now, let's introduce today's guest. Ananda Lima is a poet, translator, and fiction writer born in Brasilia, Brazil, now living in Chicago, Illinois. She's the author of the poetry collection Motherland, winner of the Hudson Prize, and her fiction debut, Craft, Stories I Wrote for the Devil, is out now. Ananda's work has appeared in the American Poetry Review, Poets.org, Kenyon Review Online, Gulf Coast, and elsewhere. And she's been awarded the inaugural Work in Progress Fellowship by Latinx in Publishing. She has an MA in Linguistics from UCLA and an MFA in Creative Writing and Fiction from Rutgers University. Ananda Lima, thank you so much for being here today to talk about your explosive fiction debut, Craft, Stories I Wrote for the Devil. The New York Times says Craft is irreverent, very conscious of form. This is a remarkable debut that announces the arrival of a towering talent in speculative fiction. Publishers Weekly says a terrific fiction debut. The stories and the stories within those stories connect to some of the cruelest portions of the human experience with uncommon warmth and wit. And a starred review library journal says one of the most original and unforgettable reads of the year. Author Kelley Vick says, my only problem with this book is the title, and that's because I love it so much. Ananda Lima didn't write these stories for the devil. She wrote them for me. An absolutely thrilling reminder that short stories can be the best kind of magic, conjuring up not only the devil, but real emotion, real surprise, real strangeness. And one more, because there are so many, and Kevin Wilson's great. Author Kevin Wilson says the stories in Ananda Lima's incredible collection do something nearly impossible. They open up surreal and strange worlds that somehow resonate within the private spaces of our own hearts. Lima's writing, like the best works of literature, confronts the fear of putting words on the page and transcends that fear to make something truly wondrous. And there are many, many more, but we'll leave it there. So with that, Ananda, what can you tell us about Craft, Stories I Wrote for the Devil? How would you describe it?
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here and for this beautiful introduction. I so appreciate it. It's great to be here. Thank you. So Craft, Stories I Wrote for the Devil is a short story collection, and you could read the stories independently, like that would work, but it also has a meta frame of the author writing the stories, who's like a Brazilian woman, with curly hair, maybe similar to someone here. And she met the devil and had a little thing with him in her 20s, a different time, but they kept in touch, and it's about the writing of the stories, as well as sort of the world we live in. It's very grounded and inspired by the last several years that we've been through.
What was the initial inspiration for the book? You wrote some of the stories as kind of standalone pieces when you were working on your MFA, is that right?
That's right. That's right. So I was working on a novel, not anything to do with this, except that I remember there was like a devil-like figure, but it wasn't like this. And when I came into the MFA, but that wasn't doing it for me. It was something that readers, like the few readers I had, like the MFA people and application people, they liked, but I was like, no, I'm not having a good time writing this book. and I was writing the stories to sort of because we had workshop and everything. And I realized that I was doing something in the stories that I really liked, that was moving me and it was interesting me. So I kind of switched halfway to working on more stories. And at some point, when I had a few of them, I saw how they worked together more than other stories I had written before. I thought that together they did more than they did individually even. So eventually I came up with the name Craft, and that really helped me because I was like, oh, this is what this is about, on both
Mhm.
levels. But the inspiration came from so many places because of this genesis that is like with the beginning short stories. So there's big ones, but there's so many things. Um, one is the devil, the history of the devil, and reading about this figure and how it's been used throughout history. That was something that was really interesting me when I was writing this, and it fit really well with this meta theme too that I have about writing because uh, it's a figure that it's so much about storytelling, and there's many other things in there too.
Well, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the devil and what is it that interests you about the devil as a character?
Right. So I had some of the stories going on already before the devil, and they had this eerie vibe and this meta vibe, and I feel like I was reading theory. What happens is like
Mhm.
I went to graduate school for linguistics, very different. And one thing is to do these things for homework, but reading theory for like fun is great because you don't have to like. So I
I
was
know what you
reading
mean.
this. Right, you just read it and then you forget. That's totally fine. So and also no shade, it's like great reading. It's so interesting, but also it's great at putting you to sleep. Like a good theory book. It's like, oh, this is so interesting, and then you're sleeping. So I had one of those that is excellent, which is Adam Kotsko is a political theologist, and what he studies is it's kind of like less like in a religious sense, but more like, oh, how do these concepts work in society and how do they
Hmm.
evolve? And he had a whole book about the devil, was his dissertation thesis, and he has other ones too. But I was reading this book and it was so interesting. Both the character is so prevalent even before I read it. It's so prevalent and it sort of sparks the imagination.
Mhm.
But it's just so interesting to see the formation of that concept and how it was used by different groups throughout history. And I thought it was just fascinating. And some of the stuff the thesis of this writer is that even people who are secular in their speech, they are using some ideas that came from demonization, right? Um,
Mhm.
so, so it was just so similar, certain uses of the devil to how people talk about, I don't know, immigrants or trans people, or whatever. Um, so I thought the storytelling and the rhetoric and the narratives were so interesting in this sort of more I don't know, theory level,
Yeah.
but also, like there's such fun, vivid depictions of the devil everywhere. The Master and Margarita, I love, love, love that book.
Mhm.
Um, and then in Brazil, also in folk culture, like there's wood print stamps with the devil and stories that you buy in chapbooks on the street, like
Mhm. Mhm.
and they have all these devil stories where we think of the devil as a trickster, but often in these stories in Brazil, it's the people who trick the devil. They're like, oh, yeah, I'll sell you my soul.
See.
That's fine. And they get that thing, and then they go and like find a way to sneak out of it or something.
Poor devil.
I know.
The
Yes.
book is often categorized as horror, but you've said that that initially surprised you.
Yes, yes. So it's been, I think I love tour. It's been such a wild adventure. It was a complete surprise for me because I am so scared of horror. Like I would run like no way, you know. So I can't, for example, watch movies. That is very difficult for me. I stopped doing that like a long time ago because I just realized there's too much suffering after, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, like I can't go to the bathroom by myself. It's just terrible. But but I saw it in the very final marketing materials. They were saying, "Hey, here's the listing," and then I saw their horror, and I thought it was so funny. I thought it was hilarious, and I really liked it because I thought my friends would think it's funny. But I didn't know that world very well. So it has been really great too because I met a lot of people, and now slowly but surely I am reading horror because I'm involved in the community and I love the community. And what I figured is that the boundaries of there's a lot of things that are horror, right? There's
Yeah.
so it's been really great. But I was totally surprised, but also like I'm very happy that it turned out
Do
that
you
way.
think you'll write more horror now?
You know what? Like, I love hanging out with the horror writers so much that I have to write, even if I don't write only horror, I'll have to write some horror to like keep hanging out with them. I do have part of an anthology that is coming up that I have to have a horror short story. So I'm like, okay, it's gonna continue, you know.
You have said that once you came up with the idea to create the frame for the stories
Mhm.
to live within and craft, you wanted to be very careful about the thickness of
Yeah.
that frame. Can you talk about that and what that means and how that worked out?
That's great. So once, like, you know, I had this frame of the writer writing the stories. For me, that was very fun and exciting because the stories were already very meta. They had writers
Mm.
revising other writers in the in the stories, and I could get out, right? So go up out of the stories. But I didn't want to trap the stories within a novel because then this effect would stop. It wouldn't work the same way.
Mhm.
I wanted this thing where, you know, there's us in the real world and me as the writer, and then there's the writer in the book, and then it flows into the writer in the story, and maybe even another one. And I wanted this to be a little bit more permeable and like
Mhm.
maybe a little bit disorienting or unsettling for the reader. And what I found is if I made the frame story very rich and full of, you know, very full of backstory and it kind of changed the nature of the whole thing, the thing that I loved that was happening. Um, and because of the meta layer is more lasting, right? Like if you let it, it just becomes a regular novel.
Mhm.
You know. um so I was finding that, so I played a lot when I was writing to have it right where it still gives you the world of this person and it's deep and meaningful, but it doesn't demand more. You
Mhm.
know. and
Mhm.
then and then there was a it was a play with how much I share, with how much I let resonate, with the language sometimes, especially in the beginning of the frame, is a little bit more lyrical,
Mhm.
um, to set you up to have this thin layer that is there, but you're not grabbing onto the layer more than the stories, for example.
Did you have a lot more initially that is part of that frame layer and then you had to cut back?
I I did, but not in the sense of having a like big
Mhm.
storyline. It was more each individual one, like maybe it was longer and it went a little bit longer and it had more that's the word, like it's thicker, right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So it wasn't like I had the story of her doing all the stuff, but it was more like each one, some of them were a little thicker, and I was like, no, because you cross a certain threshold and then it becomes like, oh, you need more. If you're going to have this, you
Mhm.
also need this.
Mhm.
So I had to cut back in that sense where I'm like, okay, this can stand here and it doesn't generate too many questions that you want to know, you know.
Yeah. I'm curious, as we've said, the book is very meta and there are layers within layers within layers at times. How did you keep everything straight as you were working on it? I'm wondering if you have like charts all over your all over
You
your
know,
papers.
I love that. Like, I love seeing some of my friends that have charts and the post-its and stuff. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that would be so much fun. I think if I did that, I would just like publish the chart because I think it's so cool, you know. But but for me, it was a little bit more of a whirlwind kind of situation, because I feel like when I found the sort of, as a writer, the touch points of like joy for me, like it's like,
Mhm.
oh, this is fun to do right here. They started compounding, and then it was more of a whirlwind kind of thing. I wrote, and then it kind of took care of itself a little
Mhm.
bit.
Mhm.
But one big thing that I had to do for that to happen, um, was really let go of a lot of things that I was maybe worried about, that, to go, okay, I really like this effect. Not everybody will be for it, but because I like it, I'm not the only person in the world that is gonna like it.
Yeah.
So having this frame, like really changing, especially from an MFA program, going, I love the 7 people, they're wonderful, but if they don't like it, it doesn't mean nobody's gonna like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And trusting like that my own interest would be mirrored somewhere in a reader who is also into those things.
Mhm.
You know?
How did you, that was another thing that I wanted to talk to you about actually, is how you were able to sort of develop that feeling of coming out of an MFA program and kind of like getting those voices out of your head and learning to just trust that what you liked was going to get you there, you know?
Yeah, so I think I was lucky in that it wasn't something that it was something where I think I was put in the ideal conditions for that to happen, which is I had an MFA that was very lovely. I love the people there. I mean, I think people have had very bad MFA experiences. Mine was really good. I've had workshops here and there outside of an MFA that weren't great, but I had such a great cohort. Um, there were people who really cared for each other.
Mhm.
However, not everybody liked this kind of stuff. So there was kind of a bifurcation of the sort of realists, so people who wrote very lovely, but very sort of immersive, realistic, not meta at all,
Mhm.
not trippy at all, fiction. And then there was some people who were like kind of trippy. So I did my first semester with the trippy people, and then I got put in a whole year with the realists. So basically, they were super kind and super lovely, but you could tell that they're like, what is going on? Why? Why? You know? So I had this difficult but very good in the end, um, position where I was not thinking that the people were being mean or anything. I was like, no, these are generally people who don't like this kind of thing. Um,
Mhm.
and I had to go through it. And a couple of things. One is that they didn't like this kind of thing when other writers did it too. It wasn't just me. So we would read books together, and I would be like, oh my gosh, this book is so amazing. I love how it does this. And they're like, I don't know. So I could see how it's not just that I write badly, because obviously this book that I love is lovable, you
Mhm.
know.
Yeah.
Um, but it's just that they don't like this kind of thing. And then this is one thing that happened. And the other thing is like writing, I was like, oh, I cannot please them because they just don't like this kind of thing. So because I could not please them, it kind of released me. And I started to please myself. So it was a process, I think, because of the situation that I was in. And I think you can arrive that for sure, like in many different ways. But for me, it kind of helped,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you also worked with an editor before you started working
Yes.
with your agent, right?
Which was my editor in the end. It was beautiful. Yeah,
Oh,
so she was my editor at tour, but she wasn't yet contracted to the book. So perfect. So yeah, so I won this wonderful fellowship called Latinx in Publishing fellowship. Uh, work in progress. That's what it is. So you had to send a full manuscript that wasn't ready, but it was like the whole draft, right?
Mhm.
And it was the first one. So I won and I was so excited. And they paired me with an editor. They didn't sort of choose us to match us. They chose us independently of each other. Okay, this is the editor, this is the match, the fellow. And the point was just for her to give me some tips and for us to work together on a manuscript for me to then submit to an agent or something like that. It wasn't that she was going to buy the book. Um, and because she was at Tor, and as I said, right, like I'm like, I love like sci-fi and all this stuff, but I'm like, oh, I wish I could write these amazing books, but I'm like a literary person, right? So so I thought in my head, this is gonna be super fun. I'll get a fresh perspective, and I don't think it's gonna be anything else, but that is already great. But from the very beginning, Ellie, who's my editor, was the best reader I've ever had for my work. It was just like she got everything. I thought we would find something to talk about, but she saw all the things. She would go like, "Oh, I see this thing here." I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I thought this would forever be only in my head, but I know this is there," you
Mhm.
know. Um, so it was such a magical experience for me because I was like, oh, this oh actually is there. It's not only my imagination. And and she was a very lovely person to work with, and she got what I enjoyed. So when she gave suggestions, were more pushing into the thing I wanted. It was fantastic. It just doesn't always happen this way, but it was just such a wonderful match. Um, so that was great. I was so happy. I was like, this was an amazing experience. Before the fellowship, I had sent the manuscript for context right before the fellowship. And I
Mhm.
had like forgotten about it, you know, because I'm sending stuff all the time.
Yeah.
But as a poet, especially, you know. Um, but then I became a finalist. Um, so I had a finalist for this prize, and I was like, oh, that's great. It's awkward because I'm supposed to be looking for an agent, but okay, now I just have to tell them, hey, this is from before, whatever. And I didn't think she wanted the book at all, just because of I didn't know if she had space for it at Tor, you know.
Mhm.
And she then said, actually, I was going to do the internal work first before I told you anything, but I want the book. I just have to first see if Tor will take it, you know? So I had this, I was like, oh my gosh. So I had these two maybes um, going on, and she had to do the work there, and eventually she took it. But that again also was a surprise for me. But it was the same editor. Then after she bought it, I just kept working with her. Which is fantastic.
Oh, that's great. That's really cool.
It
That's a
was
very interesting publishing story.
it was totally random. I'm like, this is just very, very random. There's a lot of things, you know. But it was beautiful. It was really lovely.
Yes, serendipity.
Mm, yes.
I would like to go back to something that was said in one of the blurbs for a second. Publishers Weekly said that the stories in craft connect to the cruelest portions of the human experience with uncommon warmth and wit. And I find that to be right on. Why do you find it important to incorporate this humor and this warmth um, in a book that deals with some quite dark topics?
Yes, that's such a great question. Thank you.
Mhm.
So I think uh, the time when I was writing this book was a very, I mean, it's always very hard. It's very hard now, but it was a particularly loud time for anti-immigrant stuff, you know. Um, and again, we who knows how things are gonna go, but it was like it's a difficult time, a continuation of difficult times, but it was just very present. It was very stressful. Even things like going out and doing your normal life was more stressful than usual. Um, and the news were so blaring and loud, and I was studying this storytelling, but I was also very uh I don't know. I was like, I don't know. I have to find a way to be ready to get out of here. Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
It's a
Mm-hmm.
stressful time. And I was writing. There were many very sad and heavy things in the stories. And I think one of the stories that exemplifies this nicely is the vending machine story that I
Oh,
have
yes.
here.
Yeah.
Yes. So I was very upset when I was writing that story because it was the time when the kids in the cages and the blankets was going around a lot, and it
Mhm.
was very horrible. Um, the kids in the detention centers, and I was very upset about that all the time, right?
Yeah.
Um, and the thing that stuck to me was the blankets because I'm a runner and I sometimes, I mean, I'm not that big of a runner actually. I just run sometimes. But anyways, when you go a race, sometimes if it's winter, they give you those thin blankets, right?
Mhm.
There's metallic and just the pictures of these kids on the floor of those blankets. So that blanket somehow is what gave me the Doritos package thing. Now, these things don't happen because I sit and go, hey, let me do this. It happens as I'm writing, right? The images are there and they sort of connect.
Mm.
Um, and I started writing from a very sad place. But then the humor came in very early. It wasn't like I thought this is gonna have humor. It's just very early on. It came in through the story. And as I was writing, I was like, oh, I love this. This is what I needed because I'm not saying the horrible thing is not there or pretending it doesn't exist. I'm just having space for both that and laughter to coexist because that's how we have to live, right? Um, because the stuff is not going to completely stop at any point soon, in our lifetimes or. So you have to be able to not pretend it doesn't exist, but also allow for life to have joy and laughter and for you to not be miserable 100% of the time, right?
Yeah.
So I saw in that story, I'm like, oh, this is happening here. This is very sad story, and it's dealing with this, but I am also having this humor emerge, and I thought that was what I needed in the book. Um, One thing that was great working with my editor, is like she saw that and she's like, okay, where's the joy here? And I was like, yeah, you're right. This piece, there's some beauty right here. She'll point like and go. I'm like, yes, there's some beauty right here. Like this can be a beautiful part too.
Mhm.
Um, so I felt like that balance and that commingling of the sad and the humor or the thing that you find beautiful or in
Mhm.
art or I think that they were very much had to be together in this book.
That
Yeah.
actually feeds really well into the next question that I had for you, which was that in many ways, in many layers, the book is about the act of writing and revision and of making art. And we often hear talk about God or the divine being present in great art. But you're also kind of saying, no, no, the devil's there too.
I love
So can you
that.
talk about that decision to look at writing and art from this angle from the devil's side?
Yeah. So I thought that I love that. So it's one of those things. So I feel like both in poetry and in fiction, uh, I kind of collect these different things that are very interesting or moving to me. And I don't know how they're going to manifest together, but I know they're going to go together, right? So the devil, there was all those things I was saying before about this being such an interesting figure and giving me a lot of writing energy, like reading from
Mhm.
that. And then I was doing the MFA, and then there was the stories in the news. I knew these things would go together, but I didn't know, for example, that the devil would be so cool. you know? um, I started writing him, and I really liked the devil and the writer
Mhm.
together, and the kind of nature of that like not romantic feelings, but their feelings and considerations for each other.
Mhm.
Um, and somehow the writing channeled through the devil, and I think because it came from part of it came from this sort of compassion for the figure. I know there's like a sympathy for the devil
Mhm.
thing,
Yeah.
but it's like, wow, you are like the worst. But what did you actually do? Okay, are you really the worst? You know,
Mhm. Mhm.
like that kind of feeling. Um, with the other feelings, they sort of, I feel like after the fact, I'm like, oh yeah, I see how that goes together. But as I'm writing, I just have these things floating around separately, and I don't know how they're going to come together until I write it. So the devil and the writer was so good, and he was maybe misunderstood. Um, and also he was looking for something, right? He was banished, right? He didn't have a home or a soul or anything, you know. Um, so it's like, oh no, he doesn't want people's souls, you know, that not that useful, you know. But the stories, I could see how the stories did something for him. So it was something that was not necessarily pre-planned that the creation came through this way.
Mhm.
But when I put all the factors together and I see how they channeled into each other, I was like, oh, that makes sense. You know?
Yeah. What
Yeah,
is your
yeah.
process like when you
It's
do you have like a daily writing time or what does it look like?
It's the chaotic process. It's like I think that's another reassuring thing also for people to hear sometimes.
Yes.
I have friends who are fantastic. I have friends who like are writing every day and they're very systematic, and that is really awesome for them. I very admire. But one thing that it took me a long time of suffering to realize is that I will never be that person, you know. So and that realization, realizing that I won't be that person and that I don't have to be, has been very, very good for me. Because instead of not writing and suffering, I don't write sometimes and I feel good. I just enjoy the world and, you know, and absorb. But I think the thing that I developed that is very important for my process now, as well as this sort of not beating myself up, is that I attuned what I like what moves me. I think that is the most important thing for me. So if I read something, I feel like, oh, this two things, like this person walking into this living room is really doing something for me right now. Like
Mhm.
I don't know what, you know, I may
Mhm.
not know like what it is, but I'm like, I love this. So really noticing that. Or when I'm walking around, if I see like I don't know, like a cute thing that I really like. Just recognizing those things and collecting them. Um, so that really changed my process. I'm like, oh no, what important for me personally is not to write every day, is to actually really pay attention to what is moving me and what is giving me like energy. You know, like some days
Yeah.
I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to write about this. I don't know what, but I have to write. So recognizing those things is the most productive thing for me. So if I'm not writing for like even a long stretch, but I'm like, oh no, I'm collecting things, I'm paying attention. I know this and that is really happening for me.
Mhm.
Um, that really works for me. So now that my process, like when I actually sit down to write, it's really chaotic. Yeah.
When you're collecting things, are you like always keeping a notebook with you, or are you like typing it in your phone, or
So
you
it
just collect it
varies,
all
you
up here?
know. Yeah, it varies. I wish I could collect it up here because I go like, this is the most amazing thing ever. I will never forget it. And then I'll forget it 5 minutes later, you know. Um, there are some things, like right now, I'm like very much collecting. There are some things that are bigger themes in the book. Like the next book, I already know that there's a couple of like big things that I collect even without noticing because I'm like, oh yeah, I have been thinking about this a lot. And those I don't forget. But if
Mhm.
it's like a phrase, especially because I also write poetry, sometimes like a line or something, if it's a phrase or like, then I may like go very quickly and like keep or something and notes in the phone and write like a shortcut so I
Mhm.
remember what it is. Yeah, and those really help. So like if I'm like, oh, now I really have some time, I should write something, and I have these other things. If I go and look at the notes, I'm like, oh yeah, I have some feel. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you always been a writer? What's your writer origin story?
So yes, so I think I've always been a writer, but I did not know it until very, very, very late. Because I always wrote. I always had notebooks. Um, in Brazil, in my day, when you were like in like middle school, people would write everybody would write diaries that were kind of public, like you would
Mhm.
circulate them,
Mhm.
just so weird. So I always did that. I always wrote a lot, but I thought like what writers did was mysterious. I was definitely not one of them. Um, and then I feel like much later in my adult life, when I came out and told people I was a photographer, because I did photography for a bit and it was a little bit of my day job for a short period. Um, but I also did it like for art.
Mhm.
When I told people, hey, I'm a photographer, and I had a couple of like just indie shows and things like that, I was like, oh, this is what it takes to be a photographer. You just do it and you share it.
Mhm.
And then I realized, no, I'm actually a writer. But I had been doing it forever. I just didn't think I was. Yeah.
And well, Craft is your fiction debut,
Yeah.
but it's not your publishing debut. You have an acclaimed poetry collection, Motherland. Um, so how has that experience of publishing fiction now been different than publishing poetry?
Yeah, so thank you so much for
Mhm.
bringing Motherland. Um, so um, so I think it was fantastic. Again, another thing that I really lucked out is the order, because
Mm.
it's I love Black Lawrence Press, who pressed who published the collection. They're very supportive and very smart and very good with their resources, and they do beautiful books. So I was very happy with that. But for me, it's a small press, which I love small presses. They are like the thing that keeps our culture alive,
Yeah.
it feeds, you know. Um, so I was just delighted with everything that happened with with the poetry collection. The small press has much fewer resources, and the scope and the reach of poetry is much smaller. There's just less readers, right? It really is so many less readers these days for a poetry collection.
Mhm.
But because I hadn't done it, I just thought it was beautiful. It was so lovely to have my book available for people to get it if they wanted to. Um, and to share it. So I had that first, and then with fiction, both because it's fiction and because it's a bigger press, um, it's just so much bigger. Like you
Mhm.
get more press, it goes out, like they have more resources to send so many people, like the advanced reader copies early. They have their contacts, so it's just such a bigger operation. They get it into more bookstores. So had I had that reversed, I may have been going like, oh, what is happening,
Mhm.
But for me, it was just like a great experience and then a great experience. So it's different, but I love the order because I can tell that you can have a beautiful experience with a small
Mm.
reach,
Mhm. Mhm.
and a beautiful experience with a bigger reach too. But I think the order in which they happen really helped me see that
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
How do you think your poetry informs your fiction and vice versa?
Oh, I love that. So I feel like even before I started talking about this book, I didn't realize how much. I thought there was something here and there, but I feel
Mm.
like maybe there's more even than what I thought initially. Um, One thing is the love of things that are not necessarily plot. So So
Mhm.
I love what is happening in a fiction book, and the immersion in that world is great. But there's also other beauty things that are worth it on their own. A beautiful sentence, a language, and or some fun experiment. Which of course is there in fiction too, but it's just more pronounced in poetry. Another one is valuing space. So I don't need like being a little bit more trusting of my reader, you know.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I don't need to connect every single dot for because sometimes when the reader has the space and connected themselves, it's even more beautiful and things can reverberate in their own space.
Mhm.
Um, so some of that, um, and then I feel like also the knowing, I feel like bringing that publishing conversation into it. I
Mhm.
think being okay with like, listen, this is for the people who like this thing, you know.
Yeah.
It's okay if not
Yeah.
everybody gets it. So that I bring from poetry too. Now, going back, even though my poems are very different from my prose, I feel like some poets, they write prose poems and flash fiction, and
Mhm.
they're very close to each other.
Mhm.
Mine is very different. I'm very like long sentences in the fiction, and my poetry is very skinny and long. Usually, I have the skinny long poem. Um, so they're very different in style, but my poetry is often narrative, right? Like you know what's going on.
Mhm.
I mean, there's some experimentation and things that are like push things, but for the most part, you read my poem, you kind of understand like there's a little thing that happened, a little story that you can follow.
Mhm. Mhm. I was thinking when you were talking about the publishing and the bigger experience
Mhm.
that is happening right now. I follow you on social media. I'm seeing you at all kinds of conferences and readings and everything everywhere. And I find myself wondering, how does she keep from burning out? So, so how do you keep from burning out when you're in the middle of, this sort of big publishing publicity experience right now?
So yeah, so I think this really depends on the individual person, and that they should very much listen to like their own selves. But
Mhm.
I am very much a weird extrovert in that if I'm in my house and I have to go out, like my husband's always like, no, like I'm like, oh, I don't want to go. But once I go there, I get so energized from seeing everybody, you know.
Mhm.
So I noticed that with my son too. My son, he's like a little bit shy. You wouldn't tell he's like so extroverted. He's
Mhm.
he's shy. He's not like coming, hey, hello. But once he goes out and talks to somebody, he comes back very energized. He doesn't come back tired, you know? So I think we have this
Mhm.
thing
Mhm.
where we are like truly in that sense extroverts. So because I have friends who are they're like, I cannot, I'm not doing all these events, you know. Whereas I'm like, sure, I'll do it. But I'm also you know, the when I'm like, especially in those first few weeks where it was like every day in a different city. The
Mhm.
hard thing was just the sleep because I had to catch very early flights in order to be in the other place.
Yeah.
So that was very hard, the sleep thing. And also, I'm a morning person. So over the time, I kind of figured out how mostly I try to meet people before the thing, if I'm gonna meet you.
Yeah.
Because if I have to stay up all night, like that's just too hard for me. But I think it's just my personality. I get energy from seeing everyone and I enjoy it. Um, and I know it's like I'm like, okay, I know it's just this cycle, it's gonna die out soon, you know. But it does, I like it got a second wind. Like I was like, okay, now I'm gonna like chill a little bit. But then like October was approaching, so it got a
Oh,
second
yeah.
wind. Yeah. So I've been like on the road for like months on this point, but I know that like November, December, it's gonna be like normal life again. So it's like tiring, but also fun.
Enjoying it while it's
Yes, yes, while it's going on. Yes, yeah.
What is your best advice for aspiring authors?
Nice. So I'm gonna say some advice. I don't know if it's the best because when it's like best, best or favorite, I just forget everything.
Mhm.
So, so um, so I would say a couple of things. One is to separate uh, career and success from how you see your work, right? Like it's good to listen to people, right? Like it's good to get feedback and to be honest with yourself and like, oh, this needs to be rewritten and it's hard, but be able to listen to that part of it,
Mhm.
but separate the actual like, oh, I got an agent, I got published, I got a prize. Yes, those things go to great books very often. But there's so many great works that are not getting those things.
Mhm.
So they do reflect achievement and talent, but uh, but it's not a two-way thing, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
so like I've seen it with friends who had amazing books, um, like that didn't get picked up by an agent straight away, and then they had to write another book, and that one got picked up, and they were amazing books. It wasn't because it was a bad book. There's a lot of timing and luck
Mhm.
involved. So
Mhm.
to be able to say, hey, that's a bummer. I can be upset I didn't get it, but don't think that therefore your work is bad. You know. I
Yeah.
think that's a very important thing. And then paired with that is just it just takes a lot of persistence. And you hear a note, you just keep going and see that as a maybe unpleasant, but just regular. It's not just you; it's for everybody. You
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
persistence and be able to not value a work only on external things. You know.
Yeah. That's great advice and a great way
Yeah.
of looking at the landscape of things.
Yeah.
We have a traditional last question for this podcast. Um, when Craft Stories I Wrote for the Devil is made into a movie or series, what do you think the theme song should be?
Oh my gosh. That is very hard because I'm very not with it and I don't know what's going on. Like I hear the songs, but I don't know who anybody
The
is.
same, actually.
Yeah. So it's like teaching now. People say like I have no idea what anybody's listening to. However, um, I think that with the caveat that I'll give this decision to people who know more and will do a much better job than me. I feel like the frame story and the first story have a lot of possible songs. One is Tainted Love because that was I was in the the remake, the one that is
Mhm.
like very popular.
Mhm.
Because I was listening to that a lot during the party scenes and
Mhm.
lots of the Cure songs.
Mhm.
So a lot of songs from that era, I think, go very well, at least for if they're doing the first story.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah. Yes.
Now I need to go listen to Tainted Love. Okay.
Yes.
Ananda Lima, thank you so much for being here today. It has been so amazing getting to sit here and talk with you.
Thank you so much. This was so lovely, and thank you for this beautiful podcast.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.